My son ripped the phone from my hands and hurled it to the floor with such force that pieces of plastic scattered across the hardwood like shattered teeth. His voice dripped with contempt as he stood over me. "I'm so happy you're here. Just so you know, this is a real story. But to protect the identity of the person who shared it, we've chosen to use fictional names. Stick with me until the end. And drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. You won't be needing this anymore. I'm the one who decides what's best for you now." He turned his back and walked away as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just destroyed the last thread connecting me to the outside world, as if the shock and hurt on his father's face meant absolutely nothing at all. The next morning, my room was empty, and so was my will. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it started, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. 3 weeks earlier, I was living what I thought was a decent life for a 74-year-old widower. Every morning at 6:30, I'd brew coffee in the same chipped mug Margaret bought me 30 years ago, the one with "World's Best Dad" painted in fading blue letters. She used to roll her eyes when I refused to use any other cup, but she'd smile too. God, how I missed that smile. 3 years since she passed, and I still made 2 cups out of habit. The second one would sit there getting cold while I read the paper, a bitter reminder that some routines are harder to break than others. That Tuesday morning, I was in my workshop behind the house, sanding down a jewelry box for Mrs. Davies' next dater. Her granddaughter was getting married, and she wanted something special. The familiar rhythm of wood against sandpaper always settled my mind. Margaret used to say I did my best thinking with sawdust on my hands. The oak was responding beautifully when I heard the car in my driveway, not the gentle purr of Mrs. Davies's old Buick or Frank Martinez's rumbling pickup. This was different, newer, expensive. Through my workshop window, I saw a sleek silver sedan that had no business in my neighborhood. Out stepped my son, Michael, looking like he'd walked off the pages of some fancy magazine. Behind him came Sandra, his wife, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. My heart did that foolish dance it always did when I saw my boy, 45 years old. And he was still my boy. Still the kid I'd taught to swing a hammer, still the young man I'd worked double shifts to put through college. Even if I hadn't seen him in. What was it now? 9 months. I wiped the sawdust from my hands and headed toward the house, my work boots heavy on the wooden steps I'd built myself 20 years ago. By the time I reached the front door, they were already standing there. "Michael!" I pulled open the door. "Sandra, what a surprise!" My son's smile was brilliant, the kind that used to melt Margaret's heart. "Hey, Dad, we were in the neighborhood. Hope it's okay to drop by?" "Of course, you're always welcome here." I stepped aside, noticing how Sandra's gaze swept over my living room like she was taking inventory. "Can I get you coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "That'd be great, Dad." Michael's hand landed on my shoulder, warm and familiar. For a moment, I felt that old pride swell in my chest. Sandra settled on my couch, her manicured fingers smoothing her dress. "Harold, you keep this place so nice. Must be a lot of work, maintaining everything by yourself." Something in her tone felt rehearsed, but I pushed that thought away. I manage just fine. Keeps me busy. While I prepared their coffee, I could hear them talking in low voices. Michael's voice had that edge it got when he was stressed. I'd heard it plenty over the years when he was struggling in school, when he'd gotten in trouble with credit cards, when he'd lost that job in Atlanta. I returned with 3 mugs, using Margaret's good china for them. Michael took his black, just like I'd taught him. Sandra added 3 sugars, stirring with delicate precision. "Dad, we need to talk about something important." Michael's expression grew serious, and that familiar knot formed in my stomach. The same knot I'd felt every time he'd called over the years asking for money, or help, or just another chance. "What's wrong, son?" Sandra reached over and squeezed my arm with cool fingers. Harold, Michael lost his job 3 weeks ago. The company had to make cuts. My heart sank. I'm sorry, Michael, but you're smart. You'll find something else. Michael's jaw clenched. It's not that simple anymore, Dad. The market's brutal. And with our mortgage, Sandra's medical bills. He ran a hand through his hair. We had to move out. We're in a hotel, but we can't afford it much longer. Without hesitation, I said, You can stay here. Your old room's the same. Sandra can take the guest room. Dad, that's generous, Sandra said softly. But we're worried about you, too. Michael's told me how you're here alone, managing this big house, doing heavy work in your shop. What if something happened? What if you fell? I bristled. I'm 74, not dead. I take care of myself fine. Of course you do, Michael said, quickly. But Mom always worried about you being stubborn about help. Remember what she used to say? Harold Thompson, your pride is going to be the death of you. The words hit like a punch. Margaret had said that many times. Sandra leaned forward. What if this worked for everyone? We need a place while Michael gets back on his feet, and you could use someone around. Cook meals, handle cleaning, manage appointments. Like having family around again. There was logic in it. The house felt empty most days. Some tasks were getting harder. Last month I'd nearly fallen off a ladder cleaning gutters. I suppose it could work, I said slowly. Temporarily. Michael's smile returned. Just until I get back on my feet. A few months at most. We'll help however we can. Mom would be happy knowing we're taking care of each other, Sandra added. That settled it. Margaret would have wanted this. All right, let's try it. The relief on their faces seemed genuine. Michael hugged me like when he was 12 and had broken Mrs. Henderson's window with a baseball. Thanks, Dad. You won't regret this. But I was already starting to. They went to get their things while I prepared the rooms. When they returned, Sandra immediately began what she called settling in, moving through the house with purpose, opening cabinets, checking the refrigerator, making mental notes. Harold, when were these appliances last serviced? She asked, running her finger along my 20-year-old microwave. They work fine. But they could be safer, more efficient. She opened my bathroom medicine cabinet. Are all these prescriptions current? Some look old. Michael appeared. Dad, do you have a filing system for important papers? Insurance, bank statements. I keep everything in my toolbox in the workshop. The big red one. They exchanged a glance. I couldn't read. That doesn't seem secure, Michael said. What if there was a fire? What if you needed something quickly? I know where everything is. Sandra's voice was gentle but firm. Michael handles finances professionally. Maybe he could help organize everything properly? Something twisted in my gut. I've managed my affairs for 74 years. Of course. But times change, Dad. Everything's more complicated now. Digital banking, online bills. I could help modernize things. Over Sandra's pot roast that evening, they continued their gentle campaign. Small suggestions, reasonable concerns, loving, worry disguised as helpful advice. You should have a cell phone, Dad. What if something happened in the workshop? The landline works fine. But what if you fell outside? By week's end, I had a cell phone I didn't want, a reorganized filing system I couldn't navigate, and a growing sense that my house was shifting around me like quicksand. Michael had moved all my documents to what he called proper storage, a filing cabinet in the guest bedroom. Sandra had rearranged my kitchen for efficiency, moving everything from places I'd kept them for decades. It's for your own good, Dad, became their favorite phrase. But I wasn't getting used to it. I was getting lost in my own home. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. I was trying to figure out the cell phone when it rang with some obnoxious musical tone. Hello? Harold? It's Frank Martinez. I've been trying to reach you for days. Your home phone keeps going to a recording saying it's disconnected. My blood went cold. What do you mean, disconnected? I wanted to ask about the dominoes tournament. Next week. Tom Bradley's been asking about you, too. We haven't seen you at the coffee shop." That's when Michael snatched the phone from my hands. His face was dark with something I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, almost hateful. And then he destroyed it, hurled it down with such vicious force that the pieces scattered like frightened insects across Margaret's polished floor. "You won't be needing this anymore. I'm the one who decides what's best for you now." He walked away as if nothing had happened. I sat there staring at the broken pieces, my hands shaking. From the kitchen came Sandra's laughter, light and musical, as if this was the most normal evening in the world. That night, I lay awake, Margaret's absence more acute than it had been since she died. What would she think of what our son had become? But morning brought something worse than a broken phone. I went to my workshop and reached for my red toolbox, where I'd kept every important document for 20 years. It stood open, empty. Every paper, every document, every record of my life was gone. I searched every drawer, every shelf, every corner. Nothing. Marriage certificates, insurance policies, bank statements, property deeds, vanished. I stumbled back to the house, heart hammering. "Michael, where are my papers?" But the house was silent. Their doors were closed, their car was gone. On the kitchen table sat a note in Sandra's precise handwriting. "Harold, gone to handle errands. Don't worry about anything. We're taking care of everything now." I sank into my chair. Those words crushing down like a collapsed roof. They were taking care of everything now. The question was, what did that mean for me? The silence in my house that morning felt different than the quiet I'd grown used to after Margaret died. This wasn't the peaceful silence of solitude. This was the heavy, suffocating quiet that comes when you realize you're not alone. But you might as well be invisible. I sat at my kitchen table for what felt like hours, staring at Sandra's note. "We're taking care of everything now." The words seemed to pulse on the paper like a living thing, growing more ominous each time I read them. When I finally heard their car in the driveway, my stomach clenched like a fist. The front door opened with the confident ease of people who belonged here more than I did. "Morning, Dad." Michael's voice rang out cheerfully as if yesterday's phone-smashing incident had been nothing more than a minor household accident. "Hope you slept well." Sandra appeared in the kitchen doorway, perfectly put together despite the early hour. She moved with the kind of brisk efficiency that made me feel like furniture in my own home. "Harold, you're up early," she said, already, opening cabinets and pulling out ingredients I didn't recognize. "I picked up some proper breakfast foods yesterday. You can't live on toast and black coffee at your age." I found my voice, though it came out rougher than I intended. "Where are my papers, Michael?" He paused in the act of hanging his jacket. "On the back of my chair, Margaret's chair," and gave me a look of patient concern that made my skin crawl. "Your papers are safe, Dad. I told you I organized everything properly. They're in the filing system now where they should be." "I want to see them." "Of course you do. But first, let's talk about something important." He sat down across from me, folding his hands like he was conducting a business meeting. "Sandra and I were up late last night discussing your situation." My situation. As if I were a problem to be solved rather than a man in his own home. Sandra began cracking eggs into a bowl with sharp, precise movements. "Harold, we're concerned about some of the things we've discovered. Financial irregularities, missed payments, some confusion about dates and obligations." "What are you talking about?" Michael pulled out a folder I didn't recognize. "Dad, when's the last time you balanced? Your checkbook? Really balanced it, not just assumed the bank was right. I check my statements every month. But do you understand them?" Sandra's voice was gentle, pitying. "Some of these transactions, well, they don't make much sense. A payment to an organization, that doesn't exist. A check written to cash for an amount you can't account for." My mouth went dry. "Show me." Michael opened the folder and spread out papers across the table. Bank statements, canceled checks, deposit slips, all my financial records, but arranged in a way that made my head spin. Numbers were circled in red ink, question marks scrawled in margins, sticky notes with Sandra's handwriting marking various entries. See this? Michael pointed to a check stub. $200 to Tom Bradley last month. You wrote coffee shop in the memo line. But Dad, no coffee costs $200. I remembered that check clearly. Tom's coffee shop was struggling, and I'd offered to help with some repairs. The man had been a friend for 15 years, but looking at it now, through Michael's presentation, it did seem odd. Tom needed help with— And this one, Sandra interrupted, pointing to another entry. $300 church donation. Harold, that's a huge amount for someone on a fixed income. Are you sure you meant to give that much? I had meant to give that much. It was for the new roof fund, and Margaret and I had always been generous with the church. But the way Sandra said it, with that tone of concern mixed with disappointment, made me doubt myself. Maybe I made a mistake with the amount, I heard myself say. Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest. Dad, this is exactly what we're worried about. These kinds of errors, they add up. And with people taking advantage of seniors these days. No one's taking advantage of me. Are you sure? Sandra's voice was soft, almost whispered. Because some of these payments, well, they look like classic signs of financial exploitation. Elderly people often don't realize when they're being manipulated. The eggs sizzled in the pan, but all I could hear was the roaring in my ears. Were they right? Had I been making mistakes? The numbers on the page seemed to swim before my eyes, and suddenly I couldn't remember why I'd written some of those checks. I've been handling my money just fine, I said, but even to my own ears it sounded weak. Michael reached across and patted my hand. Of course you have, Dad, for years and years. But things change as we get older. It's nothing to be ashamed of. That's why Sandra and I are here, to help protect you from making costly mistakes. What kind of help? They looked at each other, one of those married couple communications that happen without words. We think it would be best if I took over managing your finances, Michael said. Just temporarily, until we can get everything straightened out. I've already spoken to your bank about adding me as a co-signer on your accounts. My heart lurched. You spoke to my bank without asking me? Dad, you weren't here. And, frankly, some of these transactions looked so suspicious that I was worried about fraud. The bank manager agreed that having family oversight would be wise. Sandra slid a plate of eggs in front of me. They looked perfect, fluffy, golden, the kind Margaret used to make on Sunday mornings. But I couldn't taste anything except the bitter flavor of my own helplessness. I want to see my papers, I said again. After breakfast, Michael said firmly, and after we discussed some other concerns. What other concerns? Sandra sat down beside me, her face a mask of loving worry. Harold, we found some things in your medicine cabinet that are troubling. Prescriptions that expired months ago, pills that should have been taken with food but clearly weren't, doses that don't match what's on the bottles. I knew my medications. I'd been taking the same blood pressure pills for 5 years. The same. Vitamins Margaret had insisted I start after her first heart attack. I know what I'm taking. But do you know when you're taking them? Michael pulled out another folder. We found pill bottles with the wrong dates, Harold. Some bottles were nearly full when they should have been empty. Others were empty when they should have been full. Had I been messing up my medications? The thought terrified me more than I wanted to admit. What if I had been taking the wrong doses? What if my mind really was starting to go? We've made an appointment with Dr. Peterson for tomorrow, Sandra said gently. Just to make sure everything's okay. To review your medications, maybe run a few tests. What kind of tests? Nothing scary, Michael assured me. Just some basic cognitive assessments. Memory tests, that sort of thing. Standard stuff for people your age. People my age. As if 74 was ancient, as if I should be grateful they hadn't shipped me off to a nursing home already. I ate Sandra's eggs in silence, each bite sticking in my throat like paste. Around me, they continued their cheerful conversation about all the ways they were going to help me, all the improvements they were going to make to my life. The landline had been disconnected because you weren't using it anyway, and it was just an unnecessary expense. My checkbook had been temporarily secured because we need to review every transaction. My car keys had been moved to a safer place because we noticed some scratches on the bumper that suggest you might be having trouble with depth perception. B. The time I finished eating, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Everything familiar had been questioned, reorganized, or removed entirely. I wasn't Harold Thompson anymore. I was a problem to be managed, a liability to be contained. "I want to go to my workshop," I said, standing up from the table. "That's a great idea," Sandra said brightly, "but maybe Michael should go with you. Some of those tools are pretty dangerous for someone who might be having concentration issues." "I've been using those tools for 50 years. "Of course you have," Michael said, "but accidents happen, especially when people are under stress or dealing with medication confusion or just getting older." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and for a moment I saw a stranger. This wasn't the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd sacrificed. This was someone else entirely, someone who spoke in gentle tones while systematically dismantling my life. "I'm going to my workshop," I said again. "Alone." Michael started to protest, but I was already walking away. Behind me, I heard Sandra's voice, low and urgent. "Let him go. He needs to feel like he still has some control. Some control. In my own house, in my own life." The workshop felt like a sanctuary, but even here, things had been moved. My tools were rearranged, my wood supplies restacked, my workbench cleared of the projects I'd been working on. Everything was neater, more organized, and completely wrong. I stood there in the middle of my life's work, surrounded by the tools that had fed my family and built this house, and felt more lost than I'd ever felt in my life. That's when I noticed Frank Martinez through the window, working in his garden next door. Frank, who'd been trying to call me. Frank, who had no idea that my phone was in pieces and my life was falling apart. I glanced back toward the house. Through the kitchen window, I could see Michael and Sandra deep in conversation, their heads bent over more papers, more folders, more evidence of my supposed incompetence. I slipped out the back door of the workshop and walked to the fence that separated my property from Frank's. "Frank," I called softly. He looked up from his tomato plants, his weathered face creasing into a smile that felt like sunshine after days of rain. "Harold. There you are. I was starting to worry when I couldn't reach you." "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Something in my tone made him set down his gardening tools and walk over to the fence. We'd been neighbors for 12 years, ever since he'd moved here after retiring from his law practice. He'd helped me through Margaret's final illness, and I'd helped him rebuild his deck after last year's storm. "What's wrong, Harold? Do I seem confused to you? Forgetful? Like I'm not thinking clearly?" Frank's eyebrows shot up. "What kind of question is that? You're one of the sharpest men I know." "My son thinks I'm having problems. Mental problems. He says I've been making financial mistakes, forgetting to take my medications properly." Frank studied my face carefully. "Harold, 2 weeks ago you helped me calculate the board feet of lumber I needed for my new shelves. Did the math in your head faster than I could do it on paper? Last month you reminded me about my wife's birthday when I'd completely forgotten. Does that sound like someone with mental problems?" Relief flooded through me like cool water. Then why would Michael say, "Where is Michael now?" "In my kitchen, going through my papers, taking over my finances." Frank's expression darkened. "Harold, did you ask him to do that?" "He says it's necessary, that I've been making mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" I told him about the checks, too. Tom Bradley and the church, about the medication bottles, about all the evidence Michael and Sandra had presented. As I talked, Frank's face grew more and more grim. "Harold," he said when I finished, "I think you need to ask yourself a question. Who benefits if everyone believes you're incompetent?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the fence post to steady myself. That's a terrible thing to suggest about my own son." "Yes," Frank said quietly. "It is. But Harold, I've seen this before. In my law practice, I handled several cases of financial elder abuse, and it almost always starts the same way, with family members who are suddenly very concerned about their relative's mental state. But the evidence can be manipulated. Check amounts can be altered on statements. Medication bottles can be tampered with, especially if the person doing it has access to your home, your mail, your personal belongings." I felt sick. "You think they're lying? I think you need to be very careful, and I think you need to get some of your important documents somewhere, safe, somewhere they can't access them. They've already taken everything. All my papers, my checkbook, even my car keys." Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Harold, do you remember where you put your will?" "In the red toolbox with everything else." "Why?" "Because if someone wanted to make sure they inherited everything, the first thing they'd need to control is your will." The world seemed to tilt around me. "You think they would, but Michael is my son. He's going to inherit anyway." "All of it? What about charities, other family members, specific bequests? And, Harold, what if they don't want to wait for you to die naturally?" The implication in his words made my blood run cold. "Frank, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared. Harold, listen to me very carefully. Tomorrow, when you go to this doctor's appointment, make sure you speak to the doctor alone. Don't let them stay in the room. And whatever you do, don't sign anything, not medical forms, not legal documents, nothing, without reading it thoroughly." "Why?" "Because once you're declared mentally incompetent, even by one doctor, they can petition for guardianship. And once they have guardianship, Harold, you have no rights. None. They can move you anywhere they want, spend your money however they choose, make every decision about your life." I stared at him, the full horror of what he was saying sinking in. "You think that's what they're planning?" "I think," Frank said carefully, "that you need to start protecting yourself. Right now." From the house came Sandra's voice, sweet and concerned. "Harold, where are you, honey? Michael's ready to show you your papers now." Frank and I looked at each other across the fence. In his eyes I saw the same fear that was growing in my chest. "I have to go," I whispered. "Harold, be careful. And remember, don't sign anything." I walked back toward the house on unsteady legs, Frank's words echoing in my head. As I reached the back door, I saw Michael standing at the kitchen window, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "There you are, Dad," he said as I came inside. "Sandra was worried you'd fallen or something." "Just getting some air." "Well, come on, let's get your paperwork sorted out." But as I followed him toward the guest bedroom where he'd set up his filing system, I found myself looking at my son with new eyes. Was Frank right? Was this all an elaborate manipulation, or was I really losing my mind, and my son was genuinely trying to help? The terrible thing was, I no longer trusted myself to know the difference, and that, I was beginning to realize, might be exactly what they were counting on. The doctor's appointment was scheduled for 10 in the morning, but by 9:15, I was already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, my hands folded in my lap like a schoolchild waiting to be called to the principal's office. Sandra bustled around the kitchen, making what she called a proper breakfast. Steel-cut oats with fresh berries and a vitamin smoothie that tasted like grass clippings mixed with chalk. She moved with that same brisk efficiency that had taken over my home, every gesture calculated and purposeful. "Now, Harold, remember what we discussed," she said, setting the bowl in front of me. Dr. Peterson is going to ask you some questions, and it's important that you answer honestly. Don't try to cover up any confusion or memory problems. The doctor needs to know the truth to help you properly." Michael appeared in the doorway, already dressed in his expensive suit. He looked like he was heading to a board meeting rather than a medical appointment with his father. "Dad, I've prepared a list of your symptoms and concerns," he said, holding up a manila folder that seemed to have become permanently attached to his hand. "Memory lapses, medication confusion, financial errors, difficulty with routine tasks. We want to make sure Dr. Peterson has a complete picture." I stared at the oats congealing in my bowl. "What if I don't want you in the room when I talk to the doctor?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sandra stopped wiping the counter, and Michael's friendly expression flickered for just a moment. "Dad, of course we need to be there," Michael said carefully. "You might forget to mention important symptoms or misunderstand what the doctor's asking. We're your advocates." "But what if I want privacy with my doctor?" Sandra's laugh was light and musical, but there was something sharp underneath it. "Harold, honey, there's nothing you need to hide from us. We're family. Besides, Dr. Peterson will want to hear from people who live with you daily, who can observe things you might not notice about yourself." They flanked me on either side as we walked to the car, Michael holding my elbow as if I might collapse at any moment. I wanted to shake him off, but part of me wondered if he was right. Maybe I did need the support. Maybe I was more fragile than I wanted to admit. The drive to Dr. Peterson's office felt like a funeral procession. Sandra sat in the back seat, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. Michael drove with exaggerated care, commenting on every turn and stop sign as if he were giving me a driving lesson. "See how that car cut in front of us, Dad? That's exactly the kind of thing that could cause an accident if your reflexes aren't what they used to be." Dr. Peterson's waiting room was filled with the usual collection of elderly patients and outdated magazines. As we sat there, I watched the other people around me, some with walkers, some with oxygen tanks, some staring blankly at the television mounted on the wall. Was this my future? Was this what I was becoming? Harold Thompson, the nurse, who called my name, was younger than my grandson would have been if Michael had ever given me grandchildren. She led us down a hallway lined with medical posters showing cross-sections of hearts and brains and other organs that were supposedly failing in people my age. Dr. Peterson's office was smaller than I remembered, or maybe Michael and Sandra just took up more space than they should have. Dr. Peterson himself was a thin man in his 50s who'd been my physician for nearly a decade. He'd seen me through Margaret's illness, my own minor health scares, and dozens of routine checkups. "Harold, good to see you," he said, shaking my hand with the firm grip I remembered. "And you must be Michael and Sandra. I understand you have some concerns about your father." Before I could speak, Michael launched into his prepared presentation. He opened his folder and began laying out papers on Dr. Peterson's desk. The bank statements with their red circles and question marks, photographs of my medicine cabinet, even a typed list of what he called behavioral observations. "As you can see, Doctor, we're concerned about several areas of decline," Michael said, his voice taking on a professional tone that made my skin crawl. "Financial confusion, medication non-compliance, social isolation, difficulty with basic household management." Dr. Peterson glanced at me, but I felt frozen, unable to speak. Was this really happening? Was my own son building a case against my mental competence right in front of me? "Harold," Dr. Peterson said gently, "how are you feeling? Are you having any problems with memory or confusion?" I opened my mouth to answer, but Sandra leaned forward and spoke first. "Doctor, just yesterday he couldn't remember writing a check for $300, and we found expired medications in his cabinet that he insisted were current." "I can speak for myself," I managed to say, but my voice came out weaker than I intended. "Of course you can, Dad," Michael said, patting my hand in that condescending way that made me want to scream. But sometimes family members notice things that patients don't recognize themselves. Dr. Peterson looked uncomfortable. Michael, Sandra, I appreciate your concerns, but I'd like to examine Harold alone first. That's standard procedure. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Doctor, with respect, my father is clearly experiencing some cognitive decline. He might not be able to accurately report his symptoms. Wouldn't it be more helpful to have all the relevant information? I understand your concern, but medical ethics require that I speak with my patient privately first. Dr. Peterson's voice was firm. You can join us afterward if Harold gives permission. For a moment, I thought Michael was going to argue. His face flushed, and I saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. But then Sandra placed a gentle hand on his arm. Of course, Doctor. We'll be right outside if you need us. She turned to me with that practiced smile. Harold, just remember what we discussed about being honest, okay? They left the room, but I could feel their presence hovering just beyond, the door like storm clouds waiting to break. Dr. Peterson sat down across from me, his expression serious. Harold, I want you to tell me honestly. How are you feeling? Are you having any problems with memory, thinking, daily activities? For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Doctor, I don't know what to think anymore. They say I'm making mistakes, forgetting things. But I feel fine. I feel like myself. Tell me about these financial errors they mentioned. I explained about the checks to Tom Bradley and the church, about how Michael had presented them as evidence of confusion. Dr. Peterson listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. Harold, those sound like perfectly reasonable expenses to me. Have you been having actual difficulty managing your finances? Not until they took over. Now I can't even access my own bank account. Dr. Peterson's eyebrows rose. They've restricted your access to your accounts. Michael says it's temporary, until we get things sorted out. But doctor, yesterday my neighbor Frank asked me some questions that scared me. I told him about Frank's concerns, about the possibility that this was all manipulation rather than genuine worry about my health. As I talked, I watched Dr. Peterson's expression grow more serious. Harold, I'm going to ask you some standard cognitive assessment questions, but I want you to know that from this conversation, you seem perfectly lucid and competent to me. The tests were simple, remembering lists of words, drawing clock, faces, solving basic math problems. I'd been dreading them, but they were easier than I'd expected. By the time we finished, I felt more confident than I had in days. Harold, your cognitive function appears completely normal for your age, Dr. Peterson said. There's no evidence of dementia, significant memory loss, or any other mental impairment. Relief flooded through me like cool water. So, I'm not going. Crazy? Not from a medical standpoint, no. However, I am concerned about what you've told me regarding your living situation and the restrictions that have been placed on your independence. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Sandra's voice called out, Doctor, is everything all right in there? Dr. Peterson looked at me. Do you want them to come in? I thought about Frank's warning about not signing anything, about being careful what I said in front of them. Not yet. Can we talk a little more? Of course. Dr. Peterson raised his voice. We'll be a few more minutes. Harold, he said quietly, what I'm about to tell you is important. Based on my examination, I see no medical reason why you should have any restrictions on your independence. You don't need supervision. You don't need help managing medications or finances, and you certainly don't need guardianship or any other legal intervention. But they have all these papers, all this evidence. Papers can be manipulated, Harold. Medication bottles can be tampered with. Bank statements can be altered or misrepresented. He leaned forward. I've seen cases of financial elder abuse before, and they often start exactly like this, with family members who suddenly become very concerned about competency. My heart was pounding. What should I do? First, don't sign anything today. Nothing at all. Second, I'm going to give you the name of an elder law attorney. And third, I want you to consider whether you feel safe in your current living situation." He wrote something on a prescription pad and handed it to me. It wasn't a prescription. It was a name and phone number. "Put this somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere they won't find it." I folded the paper and slipped it into my sock, just as the door opened and Michael's head appeared. "Sorry to interrupt, Doctor, but we're a bit concerned about how long this is taking. Is Dad all right?" Dr. Peterson's expression was professionally neutral. "Your father is fine, Michael. His cognitive function is completely normal." The relief on Michael's face looked genuine. But there was something else there, too. Disappointment, frustration. "That's wonderful news," Sandra said, appearing beside Michael. "But, Doctor, what about the other issues? The financial confusion, the medication problems?" "I see no evidence of any medical condition that would cause those problems," Dr. Peterson said carefully. Michael stepped into the room. "But, Doctor, we have documentation, which I'd be happy to review, but based on my examination of your father, he appears fully competent to manage his own affairs." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Michael's friendly demeanor cracked slightly. "Doctor, with respect, you've spent 30 minutes with him. We've been living with him, observing him daily. We've seen the confusion, the mistakes." "Michael," Dr. Peterson's voice carried a note of warning. "Your father is my patient, and my assessment is that he is competent and capable of making his own decisions about his medical care and his life." Sandra stepped forward, her voice soft and reasonable. "Of course, Doctor. We're just concerned about his safety. Living alone at his age with no family nearby to check on him." "But you are living with him," Dr. Peterson pointed out. "Temporarily," Michael said quickly. "We can't stay indefinitely. We have our own lives, our own obligations." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Were they planning to leave, or were they planning something else entirely? "Harold, Dr. Peterson said, do you have any questions for me?" I looked at Michael and Sandra, both watching me with expressions of loving concern that no longer seemed quite real. Frank's words echoed in my mind. "Who benefits if everyone believes you're incompetent?" "Doctor, if someone wanted to take control of an elderly person's life, how would they do it?" The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Michael's face went white, and Sandra's carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment. "Dad, why would you ask something like that?" Michael's voice was strained. Dr. Peterson looked steadily at me. "Hypothetically, they would need to establish a pattern of incompetence, document financial errors, medication mistakes, safety concerns. Get medical professionals to question the person's cognitive ability. Make them doubt themselves until they accepted help they didn't really need." "That's a terrible thing to suggest," Sandra said, but her voice was shaking slightly. "Yes," Dr. Peterson agreed. "It is terrible. It's also, unfortunately, more common than most people realize." I stood up from the examination table, and for the first time in days, I felt like myself again. Not a problem to be managed or a liability to be contained, but Harold Thompson, a man who'd built a life with his own hands and wasn't ready to hand it over to anyone. "I think I'm ready to go home now," I said. But as we left the doctor's office, I realized that the house where I'd lived for 20 years might not feel like home much longer. Because now I knew what I was facing, and I knew that Michael and Sandra weren't going to give up easily. The war for my life had begun, and I was finally ready to fight back. The question was, did I still have the strength to win? The ride home from Dr. Peterson's office was like sitting in a car filled with poisonous gas. Nobody spoke, but the air was thick with unspoken accusations and barely contained fury. Michael gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and Sandra stared out the passenger window with the rigid posture of someone trying very hard not to explode. I sat in the back seat like a prisoner being transported. Dr. Peterson's note burning against my ankle where I'd hidden it in my sock. The elder law attorney's name and number felt like a lifeline, but I knew I'd need to be very careful about when and how I used it. When we pulled into the driveway, Michael killed the engine and sat there for a moment, his hands still gripping the wheel. Finally, he turned around to look at me, and the mask of loving concern was completely gone from his face. "Dad, we need to talk." Sandra's voice was ice cold. "Inside, Michael, not here." They flanked me as we walked to the front door, but this time it didn't feel protective. It felt like an escort. Once we were inside, Michael went straight to the living room and stood in the center of it like he was claiming territory. "Dad, sit down." It wasn't a request. I remained standing. "What you did in there," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "asking the doctor about people trying to control elderly people, that was completely inappropriate." "Was it? You embarrassed us. You made it sound like we're trying to hurt you somehow." Sandra moved to stand beside Michael, presenting a united front. "Harold, we've given up our own lives to come here and help you. We've put our careers on hold, spent our savings on your expenses, and this is how you repay us. By suggesting to your doctor that we're—" "What? Criminals?" "I didn't suggest anything. I asked a hypothetical question." "Bullshit." The word came out of Michael's mouth like a slap. I'd never heard him use that kind of language with me before. "You know exactly what you were implying. Maybe because I'm starting to understand what's really happening here." Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What's really happening here, Dad, is that you're a 74-year-old man who can't take care of himself anymore, but you're too proud and stubborn to admit it." "Dr. Peterson said I was completely competent." "Dr. Peterson spent 30 minutes with you. We've been watching you make mistakes and poor decisions for months." "What mistakes? What poor decisions?" Sandra pulled out her ever-present notebook. "Leaving the stove on 3 times last week. Forgetting to lock the front door. Writing checks to people who are obviously taking advantage of you. Mixing up your medications." "I never left the stove on." "You did, Harold. I turned it off myself." "When?" "Show me when." She flipped through pages with theatrical precision. "Tuesday morning, Wednesday evening, Friday afternoon." I documented each incident. I stared at her notebook, at the neat handwriting that cataloged what she claimed were my failures. But I couldn't remember leaving the stove on, not once. I was obsessively careful about things like that. Margaret had drilled it into me after a neighbor's house fire 20 years ago. "I don't believe you." "That's exactly the problem," Michael said. "You don't remember these things because your memory is going. But instead of accepting help, you're creating conspiracy theories about people trying to control you. Maybe because that's exactly what you're doing." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Michael's expression shifted into something I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, and utterly without the warmth I'd always associated with my son. "Okay, Dad, if that's how you want to play this." He pulled out his phone and started dialing. "Sandra, get the papers from the bedroom." "What papers?" Sandra was already heading toward the guest room. "The ones we hoped we wouldn't need to use." Stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Michael held up a hand, speaking into his phone. "Yes, this is Michael Thompson. I need to schedule an emergency psychiatric evaluation for my father. Yes, he's showing signs of paranoid delusions, aggressive behavior, refusing necessary medical care. No, I don't think he's safe to be left alone." I lunged for the phone, but Michael stepped back, continuing his conversation while watching me with those cold eyes. "He just tried to attack me," he said into the phone. "I think we need someone out here immediately." "I didn't attack you. I was trying to stop you from—" "Dad, calm down. You're proving my point." Sandra returned with a manila folder thick with documents. She spread them out on the coffee table like she was laying out cards for a game I didn't know we were playing. "Harold, these are affidavits from concerned neighbors," she said, her voice back to that gentle, reasonable tone that made my skin crawl. Mrs. Davies reports seeing you wandering around your yard at 2 in the morning, confused and disoriented. Tom Bradley says you've been coming into his coffee shop making bizarre accusations about people stealing from you. That's not true. None of that's true. And this, Michael said, ending his phone call and pulling out another document, is a petition for emergency guardianship. Based on your deteriorating mental state and today's aggressive behavior, we're asking the court to appoint Sandra and me as your legal guardians. The room started spinning around me. You can't do that. We can, and we are. For your own protection. Dr. Peterson said I was competent. Dr. Peterson isn't a psychiatrist, Sandra said. Dr. Reeves is, and he'll be here within the hour to conduct a proper evaluation. I felt like I was drowning in air. You planned this, all of it, before we even went to see Dr. Peterson. Michael's smile was cold and sharp. We prepared for various contingencies, yes. We hoped it wouldn't come to this, but you forced our hand. Why? The word came out as a whisper. Why are you doing this to me? Because you're sick, Dad. Because you need help. And because we're not going to stand by and watch you destroy yourself out of misplaced pride. But I could see the truth in their eyes now. The truth I'd been too loving and trusting to recognize before. This wasn't about helping me. This was about something else entirely. It's the money, isn't it? I said. The house, the savings, the insurance policies. You want it all, and you want it now. Sandra's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something ugly underneath. Harold, that's a terrible thing to say about your own family. Family doesn't do this to each other. Sometimes family has to make hard decisions, Michael said. Sometimes love means taking control when someone can't make rational choices anymore. I looked at my son, this stranger wearing my son's face, and felt something die inside my chest. The boy I'd raised, the young man I'd sacrificed everything for, was gone. Maybe he'd never really existed at all. I want you out of my house. That's not your decision to make anymore, Dad. It's my house. My name is on the deed. Michael and Sandra exchanged a look, and Sandra pulled out one more document. Actually, she said, your name was on the deed, but you signed it over to us last week. For tax purposes, remember? To protect your assets? She handed me a quitclaim. Deed with my signature at the bottom. My signature. But I had never seen this document before in my life. I didn't sign this. You did, Harold. You were having one of your confused episodes, but you insisted it was what Margaret would have wanted. I stared at the signature. It looked like mine, but something was wrong with it. The loops were too big, the slant was off. Someone had practiced my handwriting, but they hadn't quite gotten it right. This is forgery. It's a legal document, properly witnessed and notarized, Michael said. And now that we're responsible for the property, we have a duty to ensure it's occupied by people who can maintain it safely. The trap was closing around me with mechanical precision. Every move I made, they had an answer. Every protest I raised, they had documentation to counter it. They'd been planning this for months, maybe years. I heard a car pull into the driveway, and Michael went to the window. That's Dr. Reeves, he said. Dad, I want you to cooperate with him. Don't make this harder than it has to be. But I wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. I still had one card left to play, one secret they didn't know about. Before I talk to any psychiatrist, I said, I want to call my lawyer. Michael laughed. Dad, you don't have a lawyer. Frank Martinez. He handled some legal work for me. Frank's a retired neighbor, not your attorney. And besides, you can't make legal decisions while you're having a psychiatric evaluation. The doorbell rang and Sandra went to answer it. I could hear voices in the hallway, professional and clinical. Harold, Michael said, his voice taking on that false gentleness again. I know this is hard, but once you're getting proper care, once you're in a safe environment with people who understand your condition, you'll be happier, more at peace. What kind of safe environment? There's a wonderful facility about an hour from here. Very comfortable, excellent staff. You'll have your own room, structured activities, people to make sure you take your medications properly. Nursing home. They were going to lock me away in a nursing home and take everything I'd worked for my entire life. Dr. Reeves entered the living room, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the detached air of someone who'd done this many times before. He shook hands with Michael and Sandra like they were old friends. "Mr. Thompson," he said to me, "I understand there are some concerns about your mental state. The only concern I have is that my son and his wife are trying to steal my life." Dr. Reeves made a note on his clipboard. "I see. And why do you think they would want to do that? Money, property, control. Do you often have thoughts that people are conspiring against you?" The questions were traps, each one designed to make me sound paranoid and delusional. If I denied being confused, I was being defensive. If I insisted they were lying, I was having paranoid delusions. If I got angry, I was showing aggressive behavior. But as Dr. Reeves continued his evaluation, asking me about dates and presidents and simple math problems, I realized something important. I was getting every answer right. My memory was perfect. My thinking was clear, and my responses were completely rational. The only thing that sounded crazy was the truth, that my own son was systematically destroying my life to get his hands on my money. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Reeves said finally, "I'm going to recommend a 72-hour psychiatric hold for further evaluation." "On what grounds?" "Paranoid delusions, aggressive behavior toward family members, and inability to recognize your need for assistance." Michael was already on his phone again. "Yes, we need an ambulance for a psychiatric transport." I looked around my living room, at the furniture Margaret and I had bought together, at the family photos on the mantel, at the life we'd built in this house. In a few minutes, strangers would come and take me away from all of it, and when I came back, if I came back, none of it would be mine anymore. But as I sat there, something hardened inside me. They thought they'd won, thought they'd covered every angle. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated their old. Man, I might be going to a psychiatric facility, but I wasn't going quietly. And when I got out, and I would get out, I was going to show them what Harold Thompson was really made of. The ambulance was pulling into my driveway, but the war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The psychiatric facility was exactly what you'd expect. Sterile white walls, locked doors, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and unreal. For 3 days, I endured their tests, their questions, their patronizing smiles as they tried to find evidence of the mental decline that Michael and Sandra had so carefully documented. But here's the thing about spending 74 years on this earth. You learn to watch, to listen, and to keep your mouth shut when it matters. While the doctors poked and prodded at my mind, I was studying them right back, learning their procedures, understanding their weaknesses. Dr. Sarah Chen was the psychiatrist assigned to my case. Unlike Dr. Reeves, who'd seemed bought and paid, for from the moment he walked into my living room, Dr. Chen had intelligent eyes and asked questions that actually made sense. "Mr. Thompson, I've reviewed your file, and I have to say, something doesn't add up here." It was my 3rd day, and we were sitting in her office, which was painted a soft blue instead of institutional white. She had family photos on her desk, a husband, 2 young children, and I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. "Your cognitive tests are perfect. Your memory is sharp, your reasoning is sound, and you show no signs of dementia or any other mental impairment. Yet your family has provided extensive documentation of confused behavior and poor judgment. Because they're lying. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation." She leaned back in her chair, studying me. "Tell me about your relationship with your son." So I did. I told her about Michael's childhood, about how Margaret and I had sacrificed to give him every opportunity. I told her about the pattern of financial troubles that had followed him through adulthood, about how he'd always come to us when he needed money or a place to stay, and I told her about the systematic way he and Sandra had dismantled my independence. From the moment they moved into my house, Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Thompson, what I'm going to tell you might be hard to hear, but I don't think you belong here." Hope flared in my chest. "You believe me?" "I believe that you're a competent adult who's been manipulated into a very dangerous situation. What your son and daughter-in-law are doing has a name. It's called financial elder abuse, and it's more common than most people realize." "Then, you'll release me?" "I can, and I will. But Harold, may I call you Harold? You need to understand that going back to that house isn't safe. They've had 3 days to consolidate their control, and they're not going to give up just because a psychiatrist says you're competent." I thought about the forged quitclaim deed, about my empty toolbox, about all the ways they'd already trapped me. What choice do I have? "You could stay here voluntarily while we help you contact an attorney, maybe find alternative living arrangements." "That house is my home. Margaret and I built our life there. I'm not running away." Dr. Chen smiled, and, for the first time in days, I felt like someone was actually seeing me as a person instead of a problem. "I didn't think you would, but promise me you'll be careful. And take this." She handed me a business card. "That's a colleague of mine who specializes in elder law. She's helped people in situations like yours before." I slipped the card into my pocket next to Dr. Peterson's note. My small collection of allies growing by degrees. "One more thing," Dr. Chen said. "The law requires that I release you to a responsible party. Your son is listed as your emergency contact." My heart sank. "So he has to come get me? Unless you have someone else who can take responsibility for your discharge." I thought for a moment, then smiled. "Actually, I do." An hour later, Frank Martinez walked into the psychiatric facility wearing his best suit and carrying a briefcase that made him look every inch the attorney he used to be. I'd called him from the payphone in the common area, and he'd dropped everything to come get me. "Harold," he said, gripping my hand firmly, "are you all right?" "I am now." Michael arrived 20 minutes later, his face flushed with anger. He stormed up to the reception desk, demanding to know why his father was being released without his consent, why some stranger was being allowed to interfere in family business. Frank stepped forward with the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Frank Martinez, your father's attorney. I'm here to escort my client home." "You're not his attorney. You're just some neighbor." Frank opened his briefcase and pulled out a document I'd never seen before. "Actually, as of this morning, I am officially representing your father. This is a retainer agreement, properly signed and witnessed." Michael's face went white. "Dad, you can't enter into legal contracts. You're not competent." "According to Dr. Chen's evaluation, your father is completely competent," Frank said smoothly. "In fact, she's recommended that his confinement here was unnecessary and potentially illegal." "That's ridiculous. He has paranoid delusions." "What he has," Frank interrupted, "is legitimate concerns about financial elder abuse, which, as I'm sure you know, is a felony in this state." The word felony hung in the air like a thunderclap. Michael's confident demeanor cracked visibly. "This is insane. He's my father. I'm trying to help him." "Then you won't mind if we review your help with some independent parties," Frank said, starting with the bank that processed those questionable account transfers. I watched my son's face cycle through emotions: anger, fear, desperation, and finally a kind of cold calculation that chilled me to the bone. "Fine," he said. "Take him. But don't come crying to me when he hurts himself because he's too stubborn to accept the help he needs." He turned to me, and for just a moment I saw a flicker of the boy I'd raised. "Dad, I love you. Everything I've done has been to protect you. I hope someday you'll understand that." Then he was gone, leaving me standing there with Frank and a growing certainty that this was far from over. The ride back to my house was quiet at first. Frank drove carefully, glancing at me occasionally as if he was afraid I might fall apart. "How bad is it?" I finally asked. "Bad, but not hopeless." Frank pulled over at a parking lot and turned to face me. "Harold, I need to know everything. Every document they've shown you, every change they've made, every conversation you can remember. If we're going to fight this, I need ammunition." So I told him. Everything. The forged quitclaim deed, the manipulated bank statements, the medication bottles they'd tampered with, the affidavits from neighbors I'd never had problems with. As I talked, Frank's expression grew grimmer. "They've been planning this for months," he said when I finished. "This isn't amateur hour. Somebody coached them on exactly how to build a case for incompetency. Can we prove it? Maybe. But first, we need to secure whatever assets they haven't gotten their hands on yet." Frank started the car again. "Harold, do you have any accounts they don't know about? Safety deposit boxes? Investment accounts in other banks?" I was quiet for a moment, thinking about Margaret's final months, about the conversations we'd had when she realized she was dying. "Margaret made me promise something," I said finally. "She was worried about Michael, about how he'd always been. Irresponsible with money. She made me swear I'd protect myself if anything happened to her." "What kind of protection?" "There's a savings account at First National. It's in Margaret's name, with me as beneficiary. She opened it without telling. Michael, using money from her part-time job at the church. It's not a fortune, but it's enough." Frank smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen in days. "How much?" $47,000. "Harold, that's enough to hire a real attorney, pay for expert witnesses, and keep you independent while we fight this. They can't touch money that's technically still in your deceased wife's name." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of hope. Margaret had protected me even from beyond the grave. "There's something else," I said. "A safety deposit box. Margaret insisted on it, said some things needed to be kept, where only we could access them." "What's in it?" "Documents. Copies of everything important. Our real will, insurance policies, the original deed to the house." Margaret was paranoid about fires and theft. Frank pulled into my driveway, and we both stared at the house that had been my home for 20 years. It looked different now, like a fortress I'd have to storm rather than a sanctuary I could return to. "Are you ready for this?" Frank asked. "No, but I'm going to do it anyway." We walked up to the front door together. I still had my key, though I half expected them to have changed the locks. The door opened, and I stepped into what had once been my living room. It was like walking onto a movie set. Everything looked the same, but somehow wrong. The furniture was arranged differently. Family photos had been moved or removed entirely, and there was a smell in the air, Sandra's perfume marking territory like a cat. "Harold?" Sandra's voice called from the kitchen. "Is that you?" She appeared in the doorway, and I saw her face cycle through surprise, concern, and something that might have been fear. "Harold? Honey, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be getting help." "I got help," I said. "Dr. Chen determined that I don't need psychiatric care. I'm competent, I'm capable, and I'm home." Michael emerged from what used to be my workshop, wiping his hands on a rag. "Dad, this is a mistake. You're not ready." "Mr. Thompson," Frank interrupted. "I'm Frank Martinez, your father's attorney. We need to discuss some irregularities in the recent transfers of his assets." Michael's jaw tightened. "You have no right to interfere in family business. Actually, I have every right to protect my client from financial exploitation." Frank opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Shall we start with the forged quitclaim deed, or would you prefer to discuss the unauthorized bank transfers first?" The color drained from Sandra's face. "Those transfers were authorized. Harold signed documents while under duress, possibly while impaired by medications that had been tampered with, Frank said calmly. That makes the signatures invalid and the transfers fraudulent. You can't prove any of that, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. Frank smiled, and I recognized the expression from his stories about cross-examining hostile witnesses. Actually, I can. Bank security cameras, handwriting analysis, witness testimony from your father's neighbors and friends. It's going to make for a very interesting case. What do you want? Sandra asked quietly. Simple. Full restitution of all. Transferred assets, immediate vacation of this property, and a signed agreement to have no further contact with my client except through counsel. Michael laughed, but it sounded forced. And if we refuse? Then we file criminal charges for elder, abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. In this state, those charges carry sentences of up to 10 years in prison. The room was silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock Margaret had bought at an antique shop in Vermont. I watched my son and his wife exchange looks, saw them, weighing their options. Finally, Michael spoke. We need time to think about this. You have 24 hours, Frank said. After that, we go to the district attorney. This is extortion, Sandra said. No, I said, finding my voice again. This is justice. This is what happens when you try to steal an old man's life and underestimate what he's capable of. I looked at Michael, at the son I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. You want to know what your mother would think of what you've done? She'd be ashamed. She'd be heartbroken. But she'd also be proud that I finally found the strength to fight back. Michael's composure finally cracked. Dad, you don't understand. We're in debt up to our eyeballs. Sandra's medical bills, the business loans, the credit cards. We're going to lose everything. So you decided to take mine instead? We thought if we could just get through this rough patch, we could pay you back, make it right. By putting me in a psychiatric facility? By declaring me incompetent? By stealing my home? Tears ran down Michael's face, but I felt nothing but disgust. These weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of a man who'd been caught. Get out, I said quietly. Both of you. Get out of my house. Dad, you have 24 hours to decide if you want to make this right or go to prison. But either way, you're not spending another night under my roof. They left an hour later, loading their belongings into their expensive car while Frank and I watched from the window. As they drove away, I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying for weeks without realizing it. It's not over, Frank warned. They might try to fight this, drag it out in court. Let them try, I said. I've got time. I've got money they don't know about, and I've got something else they don't have. What's that? I smiled, thinking about Margaret, about the life we'd built together, about the strength she'd taught me I possessed. I've got the truth, and I've got nothing left to lose. But as I stood in my reclaimed living room, I realized that wasn't quite accurate. I did have something to lose. My dignity, my independence, my right to live and die on my own terms. And I'd be damned if I was going to let anyone take those away from me. The real fight was just beginning, but for the first time in weeks, I knew I was going to win. 6 months later, I was standing in the community center on Maple Street, looking out at a room filled with faces I'd never expected to see together. Elderly men and women, some with walkers, some with grown children beside them, all gathered for the monthly meeting of what we'd come to call the Silver Shield Support Group. The name had been Margaret's idea, in a way. I'd found it written in the margin of one of her old church bulletins. Silver years should be golden, not stolen, tucked inside the safety deposit box along with all the documents that had saved my life. Harold called Eleanor Davies from the front row. Are you ready to start? Mrs. Davies had become something of a co-founder after we discovered that Michael and Sandra had forged her signature on one of those neighbor affidavits. Turned out she'd never said a word about me wandering around confused at 2 a.m. In fact, she'd been the one to first notice their car leaving my driveway at odd hours, always carrying boxes or bags. Just gathering my thoughts. I said, adjusting the microphone that Tom Bradley had donated from his coffee shop's old PA system. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal battles, police investigations, and slow healing. Michael and Sandra had chosen to fight rather than make restitution, calculating that they could outlast an old man in court. They'd calculated wrong. Frank Martinez had been relentless, and with Margaret's secret account funding our legal expenses, we'd been able to hire expert witnesses who'd torn apart their case piece by piece. The handwriting analysis alone had been devastating. Not only had they forged my signature on the quitclaim deed, but they'd been practicing it for months, leaving practice sheets in their hotel room that the police found during their investigation. The bank transfers had been easier to unravel once we had access to the security footage. There was my son, calm as you please, presenting documents he claimed I'd signed while I was having an episode. The timestamps showed these transactions happening while I was in my workshop, completely unaware that my life savings were being moved around like pieces on a chessboard. But the most damning evidence had come from their own mouths. Sandra had kept meticulous records of their plan in a notebook she'd hidden in their bedroom, the same bedroom in my house where they'd been plotting my downfall while pretending to care for me. Frank called it the prosecution's Christmas gift. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the community center. "For those who are new, welcome to Silver Shield. For those who've been with us from the beginning, thank you for making this something Margaret would be proud of." I looked out at the faces in the audience. There was Robert Chen, whose daughter had been systematically draining his pension while convincing him he had Alzheimer's. There was Maria Santos, whose son-in-law had moved her into a storage unit while selling her house for her own good. There was James Wright, a retired teacher whose nephew had convinced him to sign over power of attorney and then cleaned out 40 years' worth of savings. All of them had stories like mine. All of them had trusted family members who'd seen their vulnerability as opportunity. "Tonight, I want to talk about something Dr. Peterson said to me during this whole ordeal," I continued. "He said that the people who abuse elders count on shame, ours and society's, to keep their victims quiet. They count on us being too embarrassed to admit that our own family betrayed us." I caught Frank's eye in the back of the room. He attended every meeting, partly as our legal advisor, but mostly because he'd become something like the son I'd lost. The irony wasn't lost on me that a neighbor had shown me more loyalty than my own blood. "But shame is a luxury we can't afford," I said. "Because every time we stay silent, another family gets away with it. Every time we make excuses for people who see our love as weakness, another elderly person loses their home, their savings, their dignity." The room was silent except for the occasional rustle of tissues. These meetings always got emotional, but that was part of their power. For many of these people, it was the first time they'd been able to tell their story without being questioned, doubted, or blamed. "I want to share something with you that I've never told this group before," I said, feeling my heart rate pick up. 3 weeks ago, I got a letter from Michael. A murmur ran through the room. Everyone here knew Michael's name, knew what he'd done, knew that he was currently serving 18 months in minimum security prison while Sandra had gotten off with probation and community service. He wrote to tell me that he's sorry, that he and Sandra were desperate, that they never meant for things to go as far as they did, that they love me and hope someday I can forgive them. I pulled the letter from my jacket pocket. I'd read it so many times the creases were starting to tear. And you know what? I believe him. I believe he's sorry. I believe they were desperate. I even believe that they love me, in their own selfish way. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. But being sorry doesn't undo what they did. Being desperate doesn't justify trying to steal my life. And love that only shows up when it's convenient isn't really love at all. Eleanor Davies dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "What did you write back, Harold?" "I wrote back that I forgive him. because carrying that anger was hurting me more than it was hurting him. But I also wrote that forgiveness doesn't mean trust, and trust, once broken the way he broke it, doesn't get rebuilt with letters from prison. I folded the letter and put it back in my pocket. Some of you have asked me if I think Michael and Sandra will try again when he gets out. The answer is no, I don't think they will. Not because they've learned their lesson, but because I've learned mine. I gestured toward Frank, who stood up to address the group. Frank has helped me set up what we call a trust circle, I continued. Mrs. Davies checks on me twice a week. Tom Bradley knows to call Frank if I don't show up for Domino's for more than a few days. Dr. Peterson gets copies of all my medical records and lab results. My banker has a list of approved transactions and instructions to call Frank before processing anything unusual. It sounds complicated, said Maria Santos. It's not complicated, it's just careful, Frank said, walking to the front of the room. And it's something every person in this room should consider. The best defense against financial elder abuse is transparency and community. Make it impossible for anyone to isolate you or control your information. But what about family? Asked Robert Chen. What about trusting our children? I felt the weight of that question settle on my shoulders. It was the heart of everything we dealt with in these meetings, the terrible conflict between love and self-protection. Trust your family, I said finally, but verify everything. Love your children, but remember that love shouldn't make you stupid. And never, ever give up your independence to make someone else's life easier. After the meeting ended, I stayed to help clean up while people lingered in small groups, sharing stories and phone numbers. This was how real healing happened, not in silence and shame, but in community and shared strength. Frank approached me as I was stacking chairs. Good meeting tonight, Harold. How are you feeling about everything? Tired, I admitted, but good tired, useful tired. It was true. The past 6 months had been exhausting. The legal battles, the media attention after our story made the local news, the establishment of the support group. But it was the kind of exhaustion that came from building something worthwhile rather than just enduring something terrible. Margaret would be proud, Frank said, echoing my thoughts. I hope so. I think about her a lot when I'm up here speaking. Wonder what she'd say about all this. What do you think she'd say? I smiled, remembering my wife's gentle but steel-strong nature. She'd say it took me long enough to stand up for myself. Then she'd probably volunteer to make coffee for the meetings and end up running the whole organization within a month. Frank laughed. Sounds like Margaret. As we walked out to the parking lot together, I reflected on how much my life had changed. The house was mine again, legally and practically. I'd had the locks changed, updated my will with an attorney Sandra and Michael had never met, and set up all the safeguards Frank had recommended. But more than that, I'd reclaimed something I hadn't even realized I'd lost, my sense of purpose. The support group meetings, the consultation calls I did for other attorneys handling elder abuse cases, the speaking engagements at senior centers around the state. It all felt like Margaret's influence, turning my pain into something that could help others. Frank, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I'm fooling myself? Thinking that what we're doing here makes a real difference? Frank stopped walking and turned to face me. Harold, in the 6 months since we started Silver Shield, we've helped 12 families identify and stop financial abuse. We've connected 43 people with legal resources they didn't know existed. We've probably prevented millions of dollars in theft and who knows how many people from losing their homes. He gestured back toward the community center, where the last few meeting attendees were getting into their cars. But even if we'd only helped one person, it would be worth it, because the alternative, letting what happened to you happen to others without a fight, that's not acceptable. I looked back at the building where we'd spent the evening, thinking about all the stories I'd heard, all the courage I'd witnessed from people who refused to be victims. You know what the strangest part of this whole experience has been? I said. What's that? I'm happier now than I was before any of this happened. Not because I went through it, but because I survived it. Because I learned I was stronger than I thought I was. Frank smiled. Margaret knew. That's why she set up all those safeguards. She knew that if push came to shove, Harold Thompson would find a way to fight back. As I drove home that night, past the coffee shop where Tom Bradley was closing up, past Mrs. Davies' house where I could see her reading in her front window, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Complete contentment with my life. My house was quiet when I got home, but it was the good kind of quiet now. The peaceful silence of a man who knew he was safe in his own space, surrounded by his own things, living by his own choices. I made my evening cup of tea, still using Margaret's good china, but now because I chose to, not because someone else. Had rearranged my kitchen. I sat in my chair, the same chair I'd been sitting in when my world started falling apart, and opened the book I'd been reading. On the table beside me sat 3 things that told the story of my new life. Margaret's picture, smiling that smile that could light up any room. My phone, the number clearly visible for anyone who needed to reach me, and a small bronze plaque that the support group had given me at our first anniversary meeting. The plaque read, "In memory of those we've lost, in honor of those who survived, in hope for those yet to be protected." That pretty much summed it up. I'd lost my son, at least the son I thought I knew, but I'd survived something that destroys many people my age, and now I spent my time trying to protect others from going through what I'd endured. Margaret always said that the best way to heal from pain was to use it to help someone else. As usual, she'd been right. I opened my book and settled in for a peaceful evening in my own home, secure in the knowledge that I'd taken the worst thing that had ever happened to me and turned it into something that mattered. Some people might call that revenge. I preferred to think of it as justice, and legacy, and love, the real kind. The kind that protects instead of praise, that builds up instead of tears down, the kind Margaret had taught me, and the kind I was now passing on to others who needed, to remember their own strength. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm. Inside, Harold Thompson, survivor, advocate, and proud defender of dignity, turned the page and continued his story. The best chapters, I was learning, were still being written. I'm really wondering now, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Have you faced something like this before? Let me know in the comments. And while you think about it, I'm leaving 2 of the most loved stories from the channel.